and I will focus on representations of sound in landscape architecture. My thesis work was very much about the experience of sound, but I approached it through a kind of understanding that included noise. So my work was very much about thinking about how can we deal with noise in a way that is kind of in line with the landscape architect's way of working. And this part of the kind of approaches that I was working with as in the thesis is exemplified in this image from a Renaissance garden in Italy, Villa d'Este, which is a fountain. And this is a very early example in landscape architecture of the use of water features in to produce sound. And as I noticed in some of my visits in Japanese gardens, these water features can be used to enhance the experience in many ways, not least because it reduces the impact of noise. And my background for going into the topic of sound in landscape architecture is very much that I'm coming from music. I've been playing a lot of music, and I've been recording music and working with music in many different ways. And as I was studying for landscape architecture, I realized gradually that there is a lot of unexplored potential for sound. It has been argued quite repeatedly that sound is under prioritized aspect, and this was something I noticed as well when I was getting into landscape architecture. So the thesis work in very much was a way of, for me, an opportunity to combine my two big interests of music and landscape architecture. And as I will come back to, they are sometimes overlapping and the borders are not so distinct. And so I mentioned this briefly. There is a notion of a visual focus within the discipline. And this has not only been noticed by me, but also by several authors before I started to work with sound. And it seems that it's particularly related to the modernistic tradition. It started around the mid-20th centuries, for instance, exemplified by Sten Eiler Rasmussen's experiencing architecture. And then perhaps culminating during the postmodern era of 1980s and 1990s with Pallasma's famous book, The Eyes of the Skin, for instance, and there are many other examples as well. And the argument was very much that if sound is considered in landscape architecture or architectural disciplines in general, it is tended to focus on noise, and while other aspects are forgotten. And this was one of the things I examined in my thesis work, if this was true as a starting point for going into it. But before I come back to what I found, this is an image. There has been many attempts to try and explain what the reason is for this visual focus within the discipline, and it has been also connected to a visual focus for the Western society as a whole. So there is something. This is something that is discussed in the history of ideas and philosophical discourses, and sometimes it was mentioned in the books I was studying that the notion of the central perspective had a big influence on the way that, for instance, the Western art and architectural discipline have been working. And this is also a good image. This is from the Renaissance, and Count Johann, the window grid from 1531, which exemplifies the situation in which many landscape architects work with today. I think it is a good representation of how we are sitting indoors to design something which is actually outdoors. And this is something I noticed when I was in Japan. There is a long tradition of working outdoors rather than indoors. So this is something we have to adapt to as landscape architects when we're working with the outdoor environments. We're working indoor with something that is outdoor in most cases. But which makes it really important that we have good representational tools for working with sound. And this is the topic for the presentation today then, to raise some examples of how we can represent sound. Even though we are working indoors, we should also be able to represent sound. And the most established method is, of course, the noise map, which I will return to, and raise that and other examples as well. But first, I want to say a few words about if the critique is valid. What I found, many of the sources that I mentioned previously have quite a harsh critique for the field, but when I studied some of the literature and some of the projects, I already mentioned how Japan, for instance, has a rich tradition of working with sound. It seems like it has been a little bit one-dimensional, and it is true to some extent, but not for all regions, not for all practitioners, and not for all projects. So there are many examples throughout history. We have already seen example from Greek theaters earlier today, and there are the Italian Renaissance gardens. There are some example in the Japanese garden tradition. For instance, already in the 11th century, in the Tale of Genji, which is a famous novel in Japan, it is stated the stream above the waterfall was cleared out and deepened to a considerable distance, and that the noise of the cascade might carry further, he set great boulders in midstream against which the current crashed and broke. And so this illustrates how this is something, sound has been something that is important in this tradition already more than 1,000 years ago. And I also experienced several examples of this very technique today when I visited gardens, in this case, Shinen Garden from the early 1900s. What about contemporary practice? To the extent that we can call 1967 contemporary, the most famous example of working with sound in landscape architecture is perhaps Paley Park in New York, which is an urban pocket park, which is interesting because they included a waterfall as one of the walls of three-walled secluded garden, which mask out the sound from the surrounding city and create a kind of privacy. It's quite loud space, but it has been studied by William White, for instance, who noticed that one reason that it was seemed to be popular was that the sound from the waterfall created a kind of privacy. There are also examples of working with masking strategies together with screens to create an even further enhanced effect, as this example in Sheffield illustrates. And projects which are more closely related to music, which the sea organ in Zadar illustrates, which is an organ essentially driven by the sea, the sound of sea waves. The pipes are kind of, the air from the water drives the sound in those pipes. So to sum up, there are a few examples of how we can work with sound in contemporary landscape architecture, but it could be higher prioritized. These are all examples that have kind of a thematic approach to working with sound and has made it kind of a thing. And moreover, many of the tools that we are working with are still visually oriented. And there's also a separation between acousticians and architectural disciplines that could be further elaborated. This was one of the findings of my thesis work. So this is why it's so important to look into the representational methods. We have, as we have already come into contact with earlier today, the noise map, which is a very useful tool and a very well-established tool. But as we know it is not possible, is not all-inclusive. There are many things that it does not say. So there has been attempts to work in the same kind of overview way and then work with illustrative techniques to kind of give a more precise idea about what kind of sounds is it, because the noise map is only giving us the sound pressure levels. For instance, if it is an ocean, it does not necessarily say us anything about the experience. So in this way, we can kind of, for instance, the first plan here is an example drawn by Per Hedfors, who is a landscape architect who was working with sound in the early 21st century and using different colors to represent different types of sound, for instance, if the sound is a moving sound. And then Vogiatsis and Remy, who did a survey in Greece, used different symbols to represent sound in an urban environment. A section drawing is another classical way of representing landscape architecture visually, which is also highly interesting from a sonic perspective because it gives us a very good sense of spatiality and how sound travels in space. And we saw some examples of the section drawing earlier today. And this is an example from Norman Booth from 1983, where he drew the sound of traffic and call it noise from the road, and then gradually going through the waterway, and then it becomes sound from water structure. So this is also an example of how we can illustrate a masking situation. Another very important tool for landscape architects is the writing, the pen. And the American landscape architect Lawrence Halprin is famous for his, together with Anna Halprin, his orchestration or his choreography of landscape architecture project. He is also very interesting from the point of view of writing because, for instance, here he uses an onomatopoeic language to describe the sound of waterfall, one of water features which he's been working on. When he says that water has sounds as well. It gurgles, it splashes, it goes plop, 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 and shh, and spats. And this is from 1963. And there's also another example by Lawrence Halprin, which he uses when he recollects his in the introduction to this book. He recollects his favorite urban experience that he has been having, and it's of course from Venice, which is a recurring theme when you're studying the landscape architecture literature on sound, because Venice has no cars, so there is a lot of more opportunity for dynamics of sound to come forward. So he says, there was no sound, no automobile exhausts, no buses, absolutely quiet in the very heart of a great city. In the distance you could hear faintly some young people singing. All of a sudden the air became dark with birds, the square filled with the beating of thousands of wings. The noise increased and increased until it was deafening, and the deserted square became absolutely filled with pigeons. The noise was incredible, even frightening. They had come to feed, and when they had finished, they left just as quickly, and the great square was empty and quiet again. So there is almost a sense of poetic character to this way of describing landscape architecture projects or landscape experiences. Another technique, which is perhaps even more common today when we have access to computers and more accessible ways to combining different data, is the collage, which is exemplified here by a piece drawn by Jamie McCutchinson and presented in a article by Michael Fowler. So Hutchinson uses different colors to represent different vehicles or different sources for sound. For instance, people's sound has one color, and then the train sound has another color, and the urban hubbub or the background noise has another color. And then he also puts a timeline so you can follow how these different sounds vary over time, because time is a very important dimension, which is quite difficult to represent in landscape architecture for sound, and one which can be very important. For instance, if there is a variation over the day, hours, and so on. And it is also interesting. There is another example of use of onomatopoetic words and kind of almost blending the borders between what is an image and what is a text. Soundscape researchers have come up with a thing called Chatty Maps. We're coming into a section now which will be dealing a little bit more with new techniques related to social media and digitalization of society. And the soundscape community has grown exponentially in the last 10, 15 years. So there are many people working with this now, and many of them have knowledge of these new kinds of techniques. So this is an example of a research group that was collecting data from, they were mapping sound types and emotional responses using social media data. The tags that were associated with the images were used to collect data about the types of sound that were found, in this case in Barcelona. So we can say they have divided the sounds in red for transport, green for nature, blue for human, and orange for music, and then a brown, blackish for indoor sound. And this, I think, this is the most dominant sounds then that they choose a color for each section. And this is a quite interesting way to put a nuance on a noise map if you combine these two ways, I think. Another social media kind of approach is the Hush City app by Antonella Radici. And this is kind of user-based. She's using it for research purposes partly, but it is also a very convenient way for citizens to map and find quiet areas subjectively then. So users can log into the application and they do a short recording of the sound environment they're mapping, and then they're adding some tags to describing why they choose this particular place and what kind of associations they get, how they relate to people based on this, and other factors. So this is an application, one way of representing sound. Then you can collect the data and you can get maps that overview the data. The noise pressure levels, it's also a way of collecting noise data, of course, even though this is a little bit unreliable, perhaps because of the calibration of mobile phones. Another mobile phone application, which is also based on partly on recording data, is the Soundscape Characterization tool by Per Hedfors, which is more directed to the practice of landscape architecture and urban planners, which is essentially a way of to help to categorize, to help put descriptions, to put words on different areas. And there are 8 categories in total in this application, and one of them is onomatopoetics. So it comes back, the use of onomatopoetic words. I wanted to say a few words about oralization, even though it's basically a technique which is based on sound reproduction. We have already heard quite a lot about oralization earlier today, which was very interesting. But this is a technique that is becoming more and more accessible, and it's a very useful, I believe, for future applications because it makes it possible to sketch in real time to see how different solutions in the landscape environment influence the propagation of sound and then also how we listen to an environment. Field recordings is also sound representation, but I want to mention it here because it can be combined with visual data in quite interesting ways. And of course, it made possible by Thomas Alva Edison when he introduced the phonograph in 1878. But now it's become so much more accessible, so almost as easy as a digital camera to use. It is very interesting, like I said, because it can be combined. For instance, it can be used as part of a plan drawing of landscape architectural projects that you can click on sound information for various sites. It can be used to produce videos, to produce slideshows, or to make collage. As in this example here, Audible Dwelling by Sandra Kopplar, who did research on how a site can be transformed by adding sound before it is built. So it kind of helped practitioner, for instance, to gain an insight into how some future changes would influence the site. And back to the research community, the Soundscape researchers, which has been developing different kinds of models for kind of conceptualizing sound environments. And here are two examples. Again, one from Per Hedfors, which makes a distinction between figure and background sounds. And based on the amount of figure on the one hand and background on the other hand, we can position a soundscape in this these kind of four different kinds of soundscape, going from mild soundscape to powerful soundscape, if it's a lot of figure and background sounds at the same time. Another model which is quite influential in the soundscape community is Pleasantness and Eventfulness by Axelsson, Nilsson och Berglund from 2010 here, which is based, it's related, but it's based on pleasantness and eventfulness, and put these two in a kind of axis situation where we get monotonous, exciting, calm, and chaotic soundscapes, depending on where in this framework we end up. I have two more examples before finishing, and the first one, both are a little bit phenomenological, so it's different examples of how you can capture the movement through space. This is an interesting method by Nina Hellgren, who quite recently presented her thesis on urban sound, which is a little bit related to the noise map, but there are some more subtle information added, which can be, for instance, we can see how the noise is quite rapidly diminishing around a corner, and this creates not only a change in sound pressure level, but also a kind of experiential effect. So, for instance, there is an effect called cutout when you are doing a transition from a very loud space to a very quiet space. It can seem to be very tranquil because of the contrast effect there. So this is an example of a phenomenological mapping, and here is another example which looks a little bit like a musical score. This is from Versailles, and Catherine Zanto, who did her thesis work in this garden, trying to gather how it was to be walking in this garden around the time of the 18th century. And there are several axes in this, for instance, fragrance and views, and one of them is sound, and we can see how the sound level is changing. That's the sound level that she has been working on it. But she has also been doing some developments of this specifically for sound, for instance, close sounds, further away sounds, and how sound can attract people to a certain space. Because we hear something, we want to walk and explore it further. So I think this is very interesting because it looks a little bit like a musical score, and it kind of puts the finger of how sound in the landscape is actually not so far away from music in some times. Finally, to conclude, as we saw some examples of earlier projects, there are increased interest for sound in landscape architecture, and also within academia there is a really increase for soundscape research and how it can be applied in planning situations. There are also many different approaches to represent sound. There is not one solution, but rather quite a few, and much more than I've been able to give today. But I think it's reflecting the complexity of the topic and the many different ways we can understand and interpret sounds in the environment. There are also some new and promising computer-based methods that I think will have quite a lot of influence in the future. And with this, I want to thank you. And if you want to, thank you for listening. And if you want to see more of these examples and listen to more sound clips, I put some examples together at this webpage, soundscapedesign.info. So this was the development of this was partly supported by the Sound Environment Center, and it's been quite recently into an English version as well. It's aimed at planners and designers of urban sound. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Gunnar.